I want to briefly talk about pawn structure, but not the entire segment for like for pawns, because pawn study or pawn structure is really interesting area of learning games. Remember, pawns are really necessary. They are not like pieces, They're not like the knights. They're not like the bishops, They do have the power to become queen. Like pawns may help get you a better position to help with your pieces, or they could become a queening. They could queen at the very end. The pawn could turn into a queen, and that's the reason why sometimes we tell like a lot of people that if you have a pawn, you're winning a pawn. You trade pieces because this baby pawn could turn into a queen, right? So to talk a little bit of pawns are you cannot really take back the pawn. You could always take back the piece, right? Like let me give you a visual example. Let's say this were to happen c4, you could go back. The pieces could go back and forth. This is not recommended though, right? You don't want to go back and forth for no reason. But pawns are really you cannot take back the pawn. You're right, right? Once you play d4, it's d4. You cannot back to d2. Sometimes you would wish when you play a game, believe it or not, like you would tell yourself, I wish this pawn was actually not being pushed, maybe like 10, 20 moves. Later, you tell yourself, what, if this pawn was on d3, maybe I would have won a game, right? You may have this kind of concept that, happens in a lot of your games. So you want to be careful when you make a pawn push, meaning there are sometimes pawn push that are weakening. When it comes to like beginners, when they play, they sometimes randomly make like a pawn moves. For example, sometimes people play like something similar to the Dutch, excuse me, d4. And then sometimes, let's say people play like knight c3, and then they may, do something like this. And then let's say this maybe people will do this. I've seen like a beginner did this kind of stuff with black. Like this structure happened with the pawn structure, right? So this is weakening. What makes it weakening? There's no need to play h6, f5. So you have to remember that these pawns, like sitting near the king, acts like a shield to defend the king. Like when the pawns are here, they are defending the king, whether you're castling, whether in the center of the board. When you play like this, let's say, what was the structure here? Did we do like f5? I think it's around here. Just to give you an example again here, let's say we played f5, knight c3, g6, knight f3, e6. It was around here though. I think it's here, e6, knight f3, and then let's say h6. That's the structure. The reason I don't remember this very well because this actually you don't play this. Like strong players would not play this kind of structure with black. I mean, this is like the Dutch opening, but you don't play like h6 here. I mean, you look over the computer, it makes us not liking it. It's like +1. And the computer is giving like e4 as a move, right? So the point, and this like one move before, it is equal. You make a pawn move, it becomes like white is better, much better, right? The reason for this is because this pawn is weakening up the squares. Like this is what we call like a weak squares, right? So a lot of beginners do not understand this concept. They just make a pawn move. They feel like, oh, maybe I could play knight f6 and h6 would take care of the jump on g5. This would be like a weakness, and obviously you could make things a lot worse if you play g5, right? So you want to be careful with pawn moves. So first thing you want to be careful about when it comes to pawn structure or pawn moves, do not really expose the pawns near your king. I'm not going to go into huge details about pawns because this is like a different topic for different video. But weak pawns, this is what I would consider h6 as a weak pawn. You want to be careful not make a move like this. This is maybe a long-term weakness. Like maybe your opponent could get a piece on h5, maybe even a pawn, maybe a piece on g6. So I could consider this as like a weakness, potential weakness. White could take charge on it later. You could still defend, by the way. I mean, black could still defend, but beginner's perspective, they don't understand when they make these pawn moves. So you have a variety of different moves. I mean, if you have to make a pawn move, you could play g6 maybe. This is still not very good, but but you could play knight f6. This is more like within maybe you could play like bishop b4. Then you could play like let's say any move here, and then maybe castles. So you could see that king is safer. It does have a safe approach. Once you play like h5, it doesn't have the safe approach, right? Because now you have potential weakness around here. So, and then maybe you're allowing some kind of knight jump. So that's another concept. Each pawn move could give a weakness around the squares. So let's say you play h5. What seems to be the problem with h5? It does allow this jump for no reason. When your pawn was around here, when you play here, you could argue, let's say you play a random move, let's play a6. When your opponent play here, you could argue that this is not a great move because I could push, right? I could kick this knight out. So there's like a way I could kick the knight out, then it's my turn. Maybe white lost a turn, lost the tempo, then it's black move here. Maybe I could play like 94. For example, I'm just not looking at this position as a way to win. I'm just looking at like giving you an ideas. So when you play h5, it's not really a good idea because this gives like a weakness, a long-term weakness. So maybe the next 20 moves, you have to suffer that g5 might be a problem, right? Because you already pushed the pawn out h5. Hopefully this becomes clear. You understand the difference. So when you play your next games, you want to be careful with pawn moves. I mean, you want to be careful with not losing any pieces, right? Pawns or knights or bishops or rooks, or losing an exchange, or blunder a checkmate. But also want to be careful with the pawn moves, because pawns are not, you cannot take this pawn back. I mean, if I play h5 in this position, I would wish I could take it back. You cannot. It becomes an illegal move. Now, with pieces, things are really different. Pieces could move around, as we discussed before. The pieces could maneuver all across, but pawns, once you are committed to make a pawn move, it's over. And I'm intentionally opening up the computer eval bar so you could see that once I played h5, things got a lot worse. I mean, black is active here, but once he plays h5, white is better. And what would make this move better? For this reasons I'm telling you, it's just weakening your position long term, and something along with g5. This potential could be weakness. Maybe h7 maybe not as relevant, but it's like g5, g6. It becomes a long-term weaknesses, and you just have to defend the entire time. Now your opponent may not take an advantage over this. Like, they may not understand what's a weak square. So g5 is a weak square, but you do have to take control over it. Like, you need to put a piece on g5. But your opponent may not be able to take advantage over this because he doesn't understand. But you probably need to understand that you don't make this kind of weakness in the first place. This would help in a lot of your games. King safety. So this is what I call like king safety. The pawns act as a way to defend the king, right? So you can see that the more the pawn's sitting here, and sometimes people would do fianchetto bishop here. This is what I play. Like, this is actually, I would be playing this kind of stuff. Let's say I'm just giving you a quick line here. Let's say here, and you could see just giving you a random move. Let's say here this happens, which is not that great, but let's say this happens. So sometimes people put this bishop as a way to defend. It's also like a defense, like the bishop gets active maybe on g7, potentially good for long term, like if you're able to get this diagonal later. But it's also used as a defense for the king. So the pawn is pushed to g6, but also the bishop acts as a weight for defense. And that's the reason why sometimes we tell people, if you give up this bishop so easily, it does give weaknesses on the dark square. So let's say, to give you an example by this, I'm just going to make a random moves. Again, let's say, I don't know how to do this, maybe like around castles, let's say here. Let's say something like here. And come on, Stellar, you could do better. You could find a way. Let's say here and here. This is probably more practical. Let's say here. This is a point. You exchange that way. So you probably want to take with a pawn. This makes more sense, taking towards the center. But when you take this way, it's not the greatest idea, because you don't take bishop takes, you take knight takes. And you can see the difference between the computers. This, again, I'm intentionally opening up the computers. This one is okay. I mean, white is slightly better positionally, but this is not okay for black. This is good for white. The reason is for this reason. Let's say, queen takes d4. The problem here is this weaknesses. dark squares around the king. So this pawn is already committed to moving to g6, but we no longer have this bishop on g7. You could still exchange this bishop for this bishop, maybe. So now you don't have to deal with the concerns about this bishop being active. So sometimes people that not really careful, all you have to do, let's say if I play here, this is like bishop h6. I mean, you're gonna win it. You guaranteed to win something here. And here it's like almost +4 at 3.5. So you do have a mate. This is one of the issues. It could deliver a mate. So sometimes people play like knight c6, not even seeing what's going on, and then you get mated on g7. Or if you have to play f6 or knight f6 or queen f6, your rook is hanging on f8. So you lose an exchange minimum here. So that's one of the reasons we tell people you don't want to exchange this bishop because it acts as a way to defense. Like it's act like a way to defend the king, and since we are committed to play g6. And also this bishop could get really active though. The bishop on g7, if it has this diagonal, it could become really, very strong later in the game. Hopefully you guys understand the concept. This is really key though. It's really key to understand the difference. It would help you in a lot of your games perhaps moving forward. So hopefully this kind of small detail would help you, in 2026. Stay tuned for more games, folks. Thank you for tuning in.